Hello and welcome to this focus talk by EIT Food. I'm John Paul Judson and delighted to be your moderator today to discuss the topic of sustainable seafood. First of all, let me introduce you to yourselves. You were more than 120 people to register for this session and from no less than 45 different countries, which means we have a truly international audience. And that means that you can all bring different perspectives to our issue today. And this is very much the spirit of these focus talks, an informal and interactive session where you can ask your questions to experts who are working in the field. If you're here, it probably means that you are interested in learning more about the topic. Some of you may have already taken the EIT Food online course on this issue, which means you may like to test some of your knowledge with the speakers. Others may be considering taking an online course. Simply, you may just have a general interest. Whatever the reason that brings you here, your questions and comments will always be valuable to us in helping raise awareness on the challenges and solutions available to develop sustainable seafood. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A and raising your questions and comments with our speakers. And we'll also be using some polls to get your feedback. And if I take a look at our icebreaker poll, because yes, in some situations, you do need to break the ice before you go fishing. I can see that I can comment on the poll. And what I can see is that for most of you, half of you, you at least have fish once a week, which probably means that we're on a pretty good basis to understand how we can make that weekly consumption ever more sustainable. For some of you, it's even many times, or at least a few times. Very few people don't like fish, 17%, only in case of emergency. Now, I don't know if that's a question of taste. Actually, in today's session, you might even hear of some alternatives to fish, which might have better taste than real fish. Who knows? There are plenty of surprises for us today, so hopefully you'll get something of importance for you. So I think it's high time that I introduce you to our esteemed speakers today. We'll first be hearing from them in a series of very short presentations so that you get to know them better. And then we'll have an interactive session. I would first like to introduce Christine Chu. She is Head of Strategic Initiatives at the Aquatic Life Institute. Christine, can you tell us something about the Aquatic Life Institute and also how you're addressing the challenge of achieving sustainable seafood? Christine, over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, John Paul. Should I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So as was mentioned, I'm Christine Xu from Aquatic Life Institute. We're an international NGO with a mission to improve aquatic animal welfare in both aquaculture and fisheries. I've been at ALI for 4 years. Before joining ALI, I worked on ending illegal fishing policy at the Pew Charitable Trust in DC, and now I live in Madrid. So at ALI, we take a 4R approach, which is reducing the number of aquatic animals involved in the seafood supply chain, refining the ways in which they're farmed or caught in the wild, replacing animal products with alternative sustainable plant-based or cell-based products, and rejecting the introduction of new aquatic animals into the system. And we take this approach in all of the programmatic areas in which we work in, including policy reform, advocating among seafood certifications, corporate campaigns, and our global alliances. I've included one example here. One of the main messages that we advocate for is shifting in how we view aquatic animals, not merely as seafood, but as individuals. So why do we advocate for this message? I'll put this into context for you in terms of the number of animals slaughtered every year globally. In aquaculture, we're talking about 100 billion aquatic animals that's farmed and killed every year. But in capture fisheries, we're talking about 2 to 3 trillion aquatic animals caught and killed for human consumption every year. Now, compared to all farmed land animals combined, this is 35 times higher, which just goes to show the huge discrepancy in the legal protections we provide for aquatic animals versus land animals, and the huge neglectedness of this issue, particularly when we talk about sustainable seafood, because animal welfare is not really in the conversation right now. Also, the type of language we use for aquatic animals is really important. You might know that we count them in terms of tonnage and say and use the word stock, as in fish stocks, instead of counting them in terms of individual animals involved, which is the case for farmed land animals. And I think this is a huge problem because, it distorts our perception of fish by reducing them to just food, and also diminishes their intrinsic value as living beings. So I want to show you some photos of aquaculture farms. This is what you typically see when you hear about farmed fish. It's incredibly varied, but actually I want to show you what they look like in real life, which we often don't take into account. So these are some very intensive fish and shrimp farms, and they often have very high stocking density, heavy antibiotic use, poor water quality, and high dependence on wild-caught fish for fish feed. Moving on to capture fisheries, similarly, these are some of the images we usually see in textbooks or online when we talk about fisheries. And in real life, this is what it actually looks like. Long lines, trawlers, and purse seines, sorry. In real life, this is what they actually look like. So we have fish dying under their own weight in these heavy, huge fishing nets, bottom trawlers that scrape everything along the seafloor and destroys everything in its path, extracting as much animals as we can with high levels of bycatch, and letting them die a long, cruel death by asphyxiation on board. Meanwhile, the global appetite for fish continues to increase. So as the demand for fish consumption grows, so will destruction to our marine ecosystems, and aquatic animals continue to grow as well. So I'll stop there, and hopefully it stirred some interest in thinking about aquatic animal welfare when we talk about sustainable seafood. I will stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. And maybe just to just push you a little bit further on this, because it's interesting how you relate, animal welfare back to fish. And it's true that you don't often think about welfare and fish together. And I'm just wondering, is it something to do with, our own inability to empathize with fish, or at least empathize much less with fish than we would with land-based mammals? I mean, is that something that is a bit challenging for us humans to actually empathize with fish?
I would definitely agree with that. In fact, personally, when I wasn't working in the animal welfare field, I never really thought about it for aquatic animals. And I think that's very common to say for most people, even fisheries management professionals and ocean conservationists. So yeah, and when we think about animal welfare, land animals, we can see them more easily, we can hear them. Aquatic animals, they don't have vocal cords, so they suffer literally in silence, which I think for people in the fishing industry, some of them are aware, but most of them, because they suffer in silence, they don't really think about that actively as they are, dumped and left on deck, basically. So I definitely think that we should bring this animal welfare conversation into our mind and the conversations that we have going forward when we talk about seafood and what's really sustainable seafood. I think it should include ethical production of, fish.
Okay, thank you, Christine. And you'll be bringing some extra points further in our conversation. I would like now to introduce a speaker that might be speaking to those who don't like fish. Let's see. I don't know. Sarah DeCoyne. She is head of food service at Better Fish. Sarah, can you please tell us something about Better Fish and your thoughts on, sustainable seafood? And a quick unmute, Sarah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for thank you for inviting me, EIT Food. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say straight off the bat, a lot of what Chris has just said, you'll hear again from me. Better Fish is a food tech startup based in Berlin, Germany, and it's our mission to make seaweed a mainstream ingredient in every food category. Our co-founders are seaweed lovers, seaweed experts, and what they realized was, in Asia there's this huge culture of eating seaweed, and it's been that way for thousands or for hundreds of years. In Europe, we're not really doing that so much, but seaweed is a really incredible crop. There are over 12,000 different species worldwide, and by kind of combining them in different ways, you can create different flavor profiles, different texture profiles, and what we realized was that actually there's a lot of problems with sustainable seafood and the status quo of that. And maybe actually seaweed could be an answer to some of those pressing questions. So if we look at the global population, as Chris said, it's growing and the demand for seafood continues to rise. 3 billion people worldwide are actually consuming seafood as their primary protein source. And of course, they're not necessarily going out and catching fish by themselves. To make this industry come alive, it takes 700 million fishermen and women worldwide. But 90% of fish stocks are either exploited or overfished. And for the farmers themselves, this is a huge problem. And actually, to give you an example, we had on the 29th of February here in Germany, we had what was called End of Fish Day, which is the day where Germany's own national production of seafood had already been exhausted. So it basically meant that demand in Germany already exceeded supply on the 29th of February for the year. So everything that we are consuming after that time has been imported. But with these fewer supplies and stocks, to use the word, fishermen and women across the world are having to go further out into the ocean. They're going on longer voyages. They're trawling even greater parts of the ocean. And so you not only have here fishermen and women who are further away from home, they're longer away from home. And they're picking up more and more bycatch. And yeah, there's a lot of not just environmental, but also social and labor standards problems involved in this as well. And so, yeah, as I said, our solution is seaweed. So we have actually made a vegan, plant-based tuna alternative based on seaweed. The seaweed is there to provide the marine flavor. It's a unique combination of 2 different species of European seaweed that we use to make the taste just like real tuna fish. And this not only has great benefits for our health. It contains fiber, it contains protein, it contains iodine, minerals and vitamins. But also back to the point of, bycatch, and what we can say for seaweed is, well, if we look at for what it takes to cultivate or to catch 1 ton of tuna fish, you're also always going to be collecting 1 ton of bycatch, which is the animals and the marine life that, in these big nets that is picked up with the fish that the fishermen don't actually want. So it's a lot of unnecessary loss of life. But by cultivating seaweed and making seaweed-based fish instead, you avoid all of this. So in theory, you save then 2 tons of marine animals that don't have to die for our consumption.
Okay, so you're looking for alternatives to fish, and you are, let's say, wrapping that, if I may say, in seaweed to still give the marine flavor. Let's say it's something like that. You're using the power of seaweed to explore alternatives to fish.
Exactly, and seaweed has tons of potential. So we're starting with alternative fish as kind of our first application of seaweed. But there's so many different species. Some that taste like truffles, some that taste like pepper, lemon, parmesan. So in theory, and what we want to do is use seaweed to make a whole host of new foods in the future as well.
Okay, but still harnessing the power of the sea. Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. You'll be bringing some points also later in our conversation. And our third speaker today is Nairita Lengosira. She is the founder of Yarsi. Nairita is joining us from Kenya. Nairita, can you hear me okay? Yeah, you're there. A quick unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you perfectly. So please, say something about yourself, about Yarsi, and how you're addressing the challenge of sustainable seafood.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, or from whichever place you're coming from. My name is Nairita Lengosira, and I am the founder of Yarsi. Yarsi is an organization that is based in Kenya. And what we do, we are an aquacycle organization, and we deal with aquatic waste. And we do produce sustainable products from aquatic waste, such as fish oil, that is very rich in omega-3. We do produce fish leather. We do produce fish meal that can be used as animal feed. And we also do produce fish bones that are produced in like an eco-friendly, eco beads. So 20 to 80% of fish gut is discarded as waste. And this creates such a huge environmental, economic, and nutritive concern. So witnessing environmental impact of the discarded remains of post-harvest losses, this motivated Yarsi to explore innovative ways to recycle and prevent valuable resources from going to waste. So as an organization, our mission is to protect and preserve the marine ecosystem by recycling aquatic waste and producing sustainable practices of waste management. So we do aim to reduce the amount of waste entering water bodies, mitigate the harmful effects of aquatic pollution, and contribute to the restoration. And how are we doing this? What is our objective as ERC? So first thing first, we do recycling innovation, where we have developed and implemented innovative recycling technologies. Number two, we do education and awareness. So where we raise awareness about the importance of recycling aquatic waste through educational programs, campaigns, community outreach initiatives, where we do encourage the government, businesses to take action to reduce the waste. Number three, we also do cleanup operations, where we do organize and coordinate cleanup operations in collaboration with the local community, environmental organization, government agencies as well. These cleanup operations, we do them to help remove waste on the water bodies and the shorelines. We do also have sustainable solutions, where we do advocate for policies and regulations that promote sustainable waste management practices. Another objectives of ERC is collaboration and partnership, where we do collaborate with industry partners, research institutions, non-governmental organizations, government agencies, where we do share knowledge, resources, and best practices of recycling aquatic waste. And lastly, we do have economic opportunities that we have created from recycling waste. We have ensured that our community, people are, they're economically sustained by producing this waste. We have also taken part in, creating an economic value for these products, and also help in the growth of circular economy, focusing on reducing waste and maximizing the efforts. So overall, YERSI strives to be a leader in the fight against aquatic waste pollution, where we're working towards a cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable future for our waterways. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nairita. And the good thing about this is that although there are some challenges, there is always some human engineering and ingenuity to try and solve some of them. So it's also interesting to hear these examples. Thanks, Nairita. And I think in the conversation you'll also be able to bring in some further thoughts. You've all I think we can bring in our speakers now, and I would like to start the conversation around this notion of overfishing or climate, and maybe we can have a poll actually for our audience. What do you think is the biggest challenge to sustainable seafood? Is it more the climate? So in general, the way the climate influences the seas and the oceans, and the animals that live in these seas and oceans? Or is it more a question of direct human intervention, right, in the form of overfishing in particular, so depleting the stocks in the ocean? What do you think is the biggest challenge? Now, obviously, the responses are coming in. At the moment, we're more going in the overfishing line rather than on the climate. I would be really keen to hear how you three attempt to answer this question. What is the biggest challenge, Christine? What do you think?
I would have to go with the audience. If I had to pick one, I would say overfishing as well, just because I think some of you already have seen the data. 90% of the world's marine fish populations are fully exploited, exploited, or already depleted. And like I said earlier, a lot of industrial forms of fishing are very indiscriminate. They catch everything along its path. They have very high rates of bycatch, ghost fishing, and seafloor damage. And when we think about the effects of climate change on fisheries or the reverse, I think a big gap in research and concern is the impact of taking these animals and in many cases their ability to store carbon out of the ocean. So if we kept them in the ocean and kept the seabed intact, then this could be a very helpful way to help deter climate change.
Yeah, so the human intervention is, also to some extent destroying the natural ecosystem, the natural habitat, which has a function in itself in regulating the climate. Sarah, what would you go for? The audience is still going towards overfishing.
Yeah, I mean, I would also have to agree, I think, although, climate extremely important, that can't be disputed. But I mean, for us in particular, we're really focusing on, or up until now, we've really been focusing on tuna, right? So the problem with tuna is you can't actually cultivate, there are no tuna farms. So all the tuna we consume has been caught in the wild. And I mean, there's kind of obviously advantages and disadvantages to wild and farmed fish. But yeah, all tuna we eat is caught in the wild, and it's, I think 80% actually ends up in tuna cans. So what this means is, if we continue to consume at the rate we are and continue, 90% of all tuna fish stocks are overfished or exploited. Like what happens when we get to 100, right? This cannot be, we can't keep doing this forever. So either something's going to have to change, because either we're going to run out of tuna fish if overfishing continues like this, or we're going to have a massive demand and supply problem. And that's going to impact a lot of people's jobs, a lot of industries, a lot of markets. Yeah, so I think overfishing.
It reminds me of a comment that I heard several times. People saying that younger generations in urban areas who disconnect a little bit from the origins of food and things like that think that milk comes from the supermarket, and then what you're saying is in the form of canned tuna doesn't really remind you much of a fish at the end of the day. It's like in a can, and so you could argue that people might think that canned tuna doesn't necessarily come from the sea, it comes from the supermarket as well. But anyhow, that might be for later. Nairita, what would be your view, because you were talking more about also some of the waste aspects and things that are ending up in seas, oceans, waters. Do you also agree that the biggest challenge is overfishing, or would you rather go with climate?
I tend to think that it's more 50-50. Both climate change and overfishing have significant challenge to sustainable seafood, yeah. But I would more intertwine to overfishing generally, considering there is more direct threat to seafood sustainability. So overfishing occurs where the stocks are harvested at a rate that exceeds their natural reproduction rates. So this leads to a population decline and potentially irreversible damage for marine ecosystems. So I'm a little bit drawn to overfishing as compared to climate change. Yeah.
It looks like you represent pretty well the audience, which is on 60-40, which is pretty close to 50-50, but edging more towards overfishing. So, okay, I think that's clear. So it means that that the direct human intervention is a really important factor that we have to consider when we're talking about sustainable seafood. And Sarah, you already started talking about, the differences between, fish caught wild and the farmed seafood part. And again, as a consumer, as someone who doesn't know that much, I would like to understand a little bit also what is the most sustainable. Is there a more sustainable option between the two, between caught wild and farmed seafood? Sarah, can you give us an indication of why there are differences and which one might be the more sustainable option?
I guess so. My expertise here is really just limited to tuna and to seaweed. As I said before, the thing with tuna is you can't farm it. That means that also has advantages when we think of things like a lot of questions we get about our products is, how much mercury do they contain, how much microplastics do they contain, and actually because tuna fish are wild caught. And they're caught when they're about 6 or 7 years old. And the disadvantage of wild fishing like this is because, these tuna fish have 6 or 7 years to accumulate microplastics and to accumulate mercury in their bodies as they're growing up. I guess you could argue that then a benefit of farmed seafood in general is that you then can control these conditions, right? You have control over the inputs that you put in, what the fish themselves are eating. But I think Chris also mentioned this, that even farmed fish are fed with wild caught fish, so you end up in kind of this situation where even maybe the reason that you're farming fish to start with, you're still having the same negative externalities that you would have had if you just caught the fish wild in the first place. When we're looking at seaweed, it also comes under seafood, of course. There's also different ways of cultivating this. So it can be, wild harvested as it grows naturally. It can be cultivated, but in the ocean, or it can be cultivated on land as well. And there's different benefits and disadvantages to all of those systems, not just in terms of, costs and sustainability, but also, how much energy does it require to and then if you're thinking you're managing a massive fish farm, that also requires electricity to run it. It requires all sorts of other inputs, and how are you getting the electricity to run these kinds of things? So yeah, I'll let somebody else maybe take over for other kinds of seafood.
maybe Christine can jump in here. I mean, on a welfare level, I wonder as well, what is the most sustainable? I'm quite curious to hear your answer, actually, Christine.
Sure. I think the biggest problem is that we tend to lump all of the thousands of different aquatic species into the term seafood, and people don't realize that it could range from something super sustainable like seaweed to something super unsustainable like farmed salmon. So I'll just give you an example. When you farm one farm salmon, you need 120 anchovies to bring it to harvest weight. So this is the issue that we're talking about when we talk about wild caught fish used for feeding farmed fish. And if you think about animal welfare implications, it's a cascading animal welfare issue. It's not just the farmed salmon, but it's the 120 anchovies that's involved in the whole chain as well. So that's one point I wanted to say. And then the other thing is, there's carnivorous species that like salmon, they really rely on wild caught fish. And then there's herbivorous or very low trophic species that don't need wild caught fish at all, like bivalves and also aquatic plants. So I think it really depends on what we're talking about. And there are some wild caught that could be more sustainable, like using low impact, more small scale types of fishing methods. And then there are intensive capture methods that are really unsustainable. And then farmed seafood as well. There's sustainable forms and very unsustainable forms.
I mean, I suppose at the end, it's also a question of scale, right? I mean, if you have few farms, it's not going to make a huge difference. If you have lots of farms, producing on a very, very high level, that's going to be more of a problem. And probably the same with wild caught. I mean, if you're wild caught in, local areas sporadically, let's say, to meet, the needs of a relatively local population, that's a very different thing than, rampaging around the whole year. So maybe there's a question of scale. Nairita, do you have anything also on this question of, farmed versus non-farmed wild caught?
Well, I'll go with Chris. I feel like it all depends with the way the production process is, because where I come from, we do wild caught and it's very sustainable. Like you had mentioned, the population is not that large. But then again, if I was in a very overpopulated area, wild caught will not be sustainable for us. Then again, we look at factors such as maybe bycatch. That is a very huge significant concern, leading to the depletion of, maybe different species that are not targeted by the fishermen. So I feel like it could be well sustainable if it is well operated, and also for, farmed fish, farmed seafood would also be sustainable if well operated. So it's just a balance of how are they producing, how are they, harvesting the fish.
Yeah, and in the chat, I see the comment there on fish feed, and maybe to go back to you, Christine, on this point. I mean, if we are indeed feeding fish with more products from the sea, that's whereas if we were to find alternative feeds stocks for fish, maybe that could also be an alternative to make a more sustainable system. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of ongoing research that's trying to reduce the amount of animal protein that is needed in fish feed. And I'm seeing the comment in the chat. Yeah, again, we use metric tons. It doesn't say anything about the number of animals, because smaller fish, they weigh less. So you need a lot of smaller fish to make one, for example, ton or whatever of one fish. So yeah, that was my answer.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting because you basically need to fish to produce more seafood and permanently. So okay, but maybe that's also part of the sustainability answer, is that there will be a need to maintain some kind of a stock in the sea as well if we're going to continue eating fish. So in a way, it kind of meets both ends. Okay, now one other thing that I would like you to maybe help more from a layman consumer perspective, because I think a lot of people want to try and do better in what they're consuming. But are there any sort of very mainstream products that are coming from highly unsustainable practices that you would say be very careful when you are consuming this type of product? Would there be any anything specific that it would be interesting for us to know? And maybe if you can just explain a little bit the background behind the one or the other example that you might highlight here. Sarah, I don't know if you want to start first.
I'm not. I think there was something that I think there's just a general lack of transparency or a lack of, I don't know, knowledge about what's really going into seafood in general. And kind of back to the topic of salmon, and maybe one of you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but so I'm a vegan myself after being years of being pescatarian, and I learned a couple of years ago that they put the color into salmon or something like this. And I think there's just a lot of things that consumers don't know, and how, in terms of how this stuff is produced and actually what goes into the practice. And I mean, I think there's been a lot of media attention around, meat production, and we've all seen the pictures of the overcrammed chicken farms and all of this, which is obviously shocking stuff. But the pictures of the fish farms, I think that's just not in common language, that we don't really talk about this stuff. So I would say to consumers in general, just ask yourself more questions and be a little bit more like, do I actually totally understand why this, not just where it comes from, but what is this that I'm eating? I think that would be, but a specific product, no, I'm not, I can't give you a specific product.
There's a comment in the chat about salmon that is actually quite enlightening. So maybe that's something that we have to consider more generally when consuming salmon. Not necessarily that every single salmon would be, coming from unsustainable practices, very likely, but at least it's potentially problematic. Nairita, do you have any examples that you would say be very careful when consuming this kind of seafood product?
I'll go with salmon again, because I have read so many journals and articles. I have watched a couple of videos talking about how the production of salmon is very unsustainable, and it has a really negative impact to the environment. Disease outbreaks, escapes. I hear when they do escape, they go back to the wild and spread more diseases and pollution. I've read about the staying in the small cages, the fecal matter and all those things. I've read about lice. Yeah. So I feel like salmon, they do destroy the ecosystem. They've led to extinction of some species, negative impacts to the world population. So I would totally maybe an advice to consumers to be very keen on when they're consuming salmon. And for here in Kenya, when I go to a store, I'm buying salmon, but I have no idea where it came from, because I know it's imported. It's not coming from Africa. It's coming from somewhere in Norway or Australia or the US. So, as consumers, we're not that conversant on what are we consuming, how is it, where did it come from? Is it a wild one? Was it, farmed? So I do believe that as a consumer, you really need to go back, research a lot, and know where you why you're consuming this salmon. Is it sustainable? Is it so I'd go for farmed salmon.
Can I just add to that as well? Like, there's a lot of talk, I feel like in Europe, maybe specifically in Germany at the moment, about regionality, regional ingredients, fork to farm, let's use, what we're growing. But I somehow feel like fish and seafood is just kind of excluded from this debate. We talk about, regional meat and, this meat was bought from the butcher down the road, and regional vegetables and seasonal vegetables. But and Germany has a kind of a similar thing where we've only got a very small bit of coastline at the top, and a lot of Europe doesn't have coastline. So where is this fish and where is this seafood coming from? And I think we need to really bring those products into this same debate if we're talking about regionality, because like for example, I speak to clients in Switzerland, and Switzerland has absolutely no coast. So when we're talking about seafood and fish, just asking yourselves, where is this coming from as well?
Yeah, and it comes back also to this question of scale, and to some extent maybe the empathy, to come back to the initial point with Christine on the perception, that we have of these things. But maybe Christine, you can also jump in. I mean, is it only about salmon, or are there maybe the one or the other example that we should also know about?
Generally, for farmed fish, I would say salmon, because it's a carnivorous species. And then in wild caught, I'm usually wary of bluefin tuna, just because a lot of them are, on the endangered species list. So those are the more common ones that people eat and should be probably aware of. But I think in general, if you can, try to eat local. Like Sarah said about, farm to fork, I know within farm to fork, they're trying to include aquaculture and seeing how we can improve sustainability as well as animal welfare in aquaculture products, so that the consumers, at least in Europe, can have a better idea of how it was treated, where it's coming from. But there are some guides, although I have to say, even like seafood consumer guides, they're very complex and hard to read for the general public. But it's, I think the first filter that you could use to kind of familiarize yourself with maybe the most common species you tend to buy in the supermarket, and try to see if it's on an okay list or a not so okay list. So I think just trying to educate yourself a little bit more. Some of the labels that we see in supermarkets could serve in certain aspects, for example, environmental aspects, bycatch, shark finning. They do look out for those issues, but there are a lot of issues that aren't covered in those labels yet, such as animal welfare. So we still have a long way to go because the seafood supply chain is so complex. Sometimes even in the US, you could catch shrimp, but ship it to Thailand for processing and then ship it all the way back to the US to sell it to consumers. So it is a very complex issue. And there's no easy.
And it's true that there's also a proliferation of claims and labels, and we are exposed to these. I recall as a student first being exposed to the notion of dolphin-friendly tuna. It was on a pizza, if I remember well, and it seemed a bit strange to me, this concept. But since I have a feeling there's a lot of claims, a lot of labels, and as consumers, trying to make a difference. I'm always worried about some of the methodologies behind. Are they actually robust in supporting these claims, or are these claims essentially marketing claims? I don't know how much you know about this. Maybe Christine, you have something to get us started here. On the methodologies behind, and are there any labels that you feel are actually useful for consumers to make decisions?
Yeah, really good question. Like I said, it's very complex, and I think the labels, they all have their own objectives, but they are benchmarked and audited, and every year for at least the aquaculture benchmarks. So maybe the audience is more familiar with ASC, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. That's the biggest consumer-facing one. We rank that one along with other 6 global certification programs and benchmark them and rank them against each other as to how they perform in terms of animal welfare. And we've done this 2 years in a row now, and every year some of them improve, and they've actually been using this tool that we generate as a marketing kind of a message to say, hey, we're actually doing something on animal welfare, whereas several years ago it wasn't even on their agenda. In terms of fisheries, we haven't seen any certifications with meaningful animal welfare standards. We hope to change this in the next few years, but they're a lot slower moving than aquaculture benchmarks or certifications.
Okay, thanks. And maybe to pick up on a question here from the audience, how effective are current international regulations and agreements in mitigating the environmental impact of the fishing industry? So how effective are the, maybe the obligations or the rules that are, imposed on the fishing industry to actually, push practices towards, more sustainable practices, essentially? Who would like to have a go at that? Sarah, maybe you want to have a try?
I'm not. Nah, I don't think that's so much. I think that, the only thing that I can think of to add is kind of going back to something I said right at the beginning, and an interesting point I noticed when you put the poll up earlier is, what is the most pressing issues when it comes to sustainable seafood, and you had climate and overfishing, and we didn't talk about the social aspect of it at all either. And I know that there's a lot of corruption that is involved in the industry, and as I mentioned earlier, like labor standards not being able to be enforced or not being enforced at all. And I guess that would also apply to labeling and certification requirements also. How we would go about solving that as a kind of global community is a much bigger challenge. I think Anybody else want to pick up?
Are you familiar with some of these international regulations or obligations on the fishing industry?
I can jump in.
Please, yeah.
So there are some regulations. For example, the EU has a carding system in which the products that they import from third countries, third water countries, they get a green card, a yellow card, or a red card. So if they don't comply with some of these regulations, for example, illegal fishing regulations, etc., they get warned. And then if the next year they don't comply again, then they get a red card and they're not able to export to the EU anymore. So that's one example of an international agreement. This is always the issue, right? We can pass a regulation or a law, but then implementation always takes, there's always issue with implementation, or it takes a lot of time to get the industry up to speed. But you know, you have to start somewhere. I wouldn't use this argument that is there implementation as a deterrence or an argument against you know, an existing policy that we have. We need to just continue moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's also something you know, on implementation in the chat there, that you know, it's not just about consumers' choices, it's also about, you know, applying rules and verifiable rules by public authorities. So that's also an important point. One question which I think is also relevant to consumers actually, and the notion of the industry behind is, you know, organic versus conventional. You know, and we have that a lot on land, but it also happens in the sea with seafood. I assume that organic is naturally farmed, but maybe there are some wild caught organic versions of that. But that would be maybe a first sub question. Does organic only cover farm seafood, and is it a solution? Does it offer better prospects than conventional farmed fish? Would anyone like to try on that one?
Can't speak for fish, but can speak for seaweed.
Please, yeah.
Like so actually interesting topic. So we the seaweeds that we cultivate and so we're actually partnered with seaweed farms and farmers. One based in Norway, one based in Ireland, and these are actually ex-fishing communities that couldn't sustain themselves on fishing anymore and have decided to use the knowledge and the infrastructure that they had to cultivate seaweed instead. So they're still living by the coast, they still have their boats, but now they grow seaweed on lines in the ocean, they're called, and seaweed is actually regenerative. So it's you harvest in May, so the seedlings are kind of transferred to the ocean in November. They grow for 6 months, and then they're cut like hair under the water and harvested in May. And this is the seaweeds we use here. These are organic farmed seaweeds. Yeah, they're organic farm seaweeds, and it's really nice to be able to kind of help or like raise the demand for these products to help these communities find sustainable sources of income. And kind of our mission, at least, is to implement this in other areas of the world as well. Yeah.
And in Kenya, Narita, do you have some organic seafood?
Oh, yes, we do have organic. I'd say for fish farmers who are doing production, I have encountered farmers who, I don't know if you're aware of Azolla. Azolla is a fern. Azolla is an aquatic fern, yeah, that is used as a feed to fish. I've also seen farmers using black soldier fly as an organic feed to the fish. So I would say there's organic seafood.
Mm-hmm. Is it a good sort of alternative? Is it a pathway for the future, Christine? Do you see that as a, you know, as something that we should consider more, or is pretty much the same problem?
I'm not an expert in this, but to my knowledge, I think organic for now is much better because at least I think in the EU, they're not supposed to use any antibiotics, which means they really need to take care of the health of the animals in order not to have disease. So they need to have proper stocking density, water quality, feed composition that goes into the feeding system in order to keep the animals healthy. And so that is already a huge improvement from conventional intensive fish farms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I would also like to open up to another topic that's hit the news quite a bit in recent years with regard to, you know, marine litter and effectively plastic litter. And that's something where we have seen images that could potentially help us empathize a little bit, you know, with sea species, you know, sort of ingesting plastics or getting caught up in plastics. But there's also the issue that's a bit more pernicious of microplastics, where the plastics are degrading and, you know, become basically invisible and enter the food chain through fish consumption. Is this one of the biggest threats that's coming up? I mean, we've talked a lot about, let's say, you know, existing threats with overfishing, and but is that one of the biggest emerging threats that you see to, you know, the ecosystem and sustainability and seafood, even for human health consumption potentially, or are there other sort of emerging threats that could be, you know, along those same lines that you would like to enlighten us with? Nairita, maybe first, because you have that focus also on the waste part.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. When it comes to plastic litter, so for water, maybe the impact on marine life. You can see marine animals, including fish, maybe shellfish as well, when they ingest the microplastics, leading to, you know, physical harm, internal blockages, you know, potential transfer of toxic in the food chain. We've also seen, you know, degradation of the habitats. We've seen microplastic accumulate marine habitats. I know everybody has like a physical, like a mental idea of, you know, oceans full of plastic, yeah, and this has, you know, seabeds, you know, coral reefs, altering, you know, all those things that are disrupting the balance of the marine biodiversity. And also, I believe that microplastic, they affect the population of the fish, because they are reducing, you know, the reproductive, altering their behaviors, maybe impacting the growth rates, you know, factors like, you know, leading to decline of their production in the fishing industry. So I do believe that microplastic has an impact on the fish, has an impact to us as human beings. When you consume this fish, has an impact to the water as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like a big issue, and I'm not sure how one can particularly tackle it. I mean, obviously at source, but then that's nothing to do with the sea. So for the communities living off the seas, that surely must be a huge challenge and difficult to carry a voice in that debate, even maybe. Sarah, what do you think in terms of like an emerging threat? Maybe it already affects also to some extent your business, or maybe it's even a concern for your business.
The microplastics one is an interesting one, and like, so I've been working at this company for 3 years and have always been consumer facing, and it's maybe within the last year that we now get consumers coming to us and saying, you know, what is the like, do you have microplastics in your products? Like, is this better for me than real tuna in terms of microplastics? And this seems to be quite a recent concern. I mean, for us, we're lucky that we are able to say, yes, it is better than real tuna, our alternative, because of the fact that I mentioned earlier that seaweeds are only in the ocean for 6 months, as opposed to tuna, which is 6 years. And it's basically just a factor of time that the microplastics can't accumulate. This obviously doesn't solve the problem. And another super interesting thing that I learned actually recently at another oceans related event was, when we're thinking of the images that Nairita just said, you know, with the plastics in the ocean, for Europeans here, these are all images we have of countries far, far away that aren't on our Mediterranean coast. You know, these are problems that are far away. But what I learned was that we're all responsible for this, and not just in terms of, you know, throwing water bottles away, but also things like fibers from your clothes. Every time you wash your clothes in the washing machine, the liquids that's drained is drained out into the ocean, and microfibers, microplastics that come off your clothes are really damaging the oceans in that way. Also, another one is tires, driving cars on tarmac roads. Every time that's abraded, there's little bits of microplastics that lie on our streets. The rain comes, the water's drained away into the ocean, and that's another contributing source of microplastics in the oceans, which all end up in our food system. So I think it's also important to be aware that we're not just eating this, but we're also contributing to these problems. And the other one is actually mercury. So it also ties back to the climate change topic we had earlier. Excuse me.
No problem.
But mercury, increasing quantities of mercury in fish stocks and fish species, bad for human health. I'm gonna put myself on mute.
No, you have a drink of water. I think that also probably fishing gear, will also be using plastic and will be in the sea more regularly, and probably is also a source. Christine, your thoughts on this emerging threat around microplastics?
Yeah, exactly. Was going to mention what you just mentioned about fishing gear. So there's a lot of abandoned or lost fishing gear that continues to kill marine life for many, many years. So yeah, it's a huge problem. But there are some companies that are developing more biodegradable fishing gear and traps that have escapement holes. So in case they are left or lost in the ocean, they don't continue to trap aquatic animals. Although it's a commendable initiative, I think a lot of them, even though it's biodegradable, it could still take up to 5 years. So that's still 5 years of entangling aquatic animals and and seabirds, and so yeah, it's a big problem.
Okay, thank you for having, taken us through various topics there. I'd just like to finish maybe with a note that's linked back more to, online learning courses, just getting to know more about different topics, right? And so EIT Food has developed an online course on sustainable seafood. And I would just like to get a sense from you, what would be your sort of call to action, for people who may want to learn more about this? I mean, why should they just want to learn more about seafood? Maybe just to say that, Christine, can you just give us a call to action?
Yeah, I really encourage you to really see the beauty in aquatic animals and think of them as individual living beings, and that they have more value being alive than dead. So I really encourage you to think about these issues with their welfare in mind, and obviously really commend you for taking courses like these and showing your interest already. So continue doing that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Christine. You, Sarah, your call to action.
Yeah, I had the same thing. Self-education, go to events, attend webinars like this, talk to experts, and not just like listening in, half an ear while you're doing something else, but really listen to the conversation and get engaged in the comments as well. I think that's a great start. So continue doing what you're doing for sure. And also, if you have any, I think a personal plug from me. If you're really concerned about your seaweed consumption and doing it ethically, you can always go plant-based and eat vegan tuna instead of vegan seafood, and then you avoid all of the problems that we just mentioned.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And you, Nairita.
For me, I'd say that us as consumers, we should have we should read more about the seafood guidelines. We should attend educational events such as this one, support initiatives that promote sustainable seafood as well, and promote vendors who sell seafood that has been sustainably produced. Yeah. Brilliant. Maybe consumers should do a lot of reading before consuming any type of fish, and I would also want them to stop. There are very many alternative sources of omega-3, sardine, the different types of varieties of fish. So when you take away the too much, what do I call it? When you focus on smaller fishes, I believe we're gonna save our ecosystems. Yeah, so leave alone the salmon, the tuna, and everything. Good for the smaller fishes. The sardines, very healthy, and yeah, and tilapia as well.
And maybe looking at a more local supply. Maybe that's also something, and farmed on a smaller scale.
Mm.
Maybe that's something that is almost a rule for land-based and sea-based and us in general. So maybe that's like a recommendation. Thank you so much, Narita, Sarah, Christine, for sharing all your insights. It's been really, really great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you also to you. You've been really, really active in the comments, and we tried to pick up as many, comments and questions as we could. And now I would like to introduce Pamela Picorni from EIT Food. She's in charge of the education program. So Pamela, please give us your couple of words of conclusion.
Thank you, John Paul, for your thoughtful questions for the experts. I just want to take this moment to thank Chris from ALI for discussing her view of sea life and the animals in the ocean to get us thinking more about their welfare as individuals. And I want to thank Sarah from Betta Fish for introducing us to the idea of alternative fish products and how seaweed can be part of sustainable seafood choices. And also, Narita, thank you for joining us from Kenya to discuss YRC's mission for recycling aquatic waste and how animal feed fits into this concept of sustainability. We really got these new ideas, and I learned so much from this webinar myself. I want to thank the audience for joining the webinar, and I hope you had a chance to think about how you can make more sustainable choices when thinking about seafood. And if you would like to go deeper into this topic, we invite you to take our course or take any course on sustainable seafood, like the experts were talking about. Just learn more. EIT Food will send out a follow-up email with the recording of the webinar that you can share with your friends and family if you enjoyed it, as well as a link to our online course. And I want to just thank everyone again for joining us, and I hope you have a good evening.
Seafood arrives at our markets packaged, labelled, and ready to be consumed. But there is a long line of stakeholders involved in getting seafood from the ocean to our plates. In this course, we will dive into the environmental and social impacts of different fishing practices and discover sustainable approaches and innovations. You'll learn to define sustainable fisheries and seafood, and together, discover the ocean of opportunities in the seafood industry fishing sector. By the end of the course, you'll have a solid understanding of the impacts of the fishing industry, as well as the emerging innovations to transform its practices.